Today, Hollis directs the Jung Center. He's one of the most published living Jungians with 11 books to his name. One of his favorite subjects, something that marked his own life, the middle passage.
I began to realize once I was an analyst that no matter how different people's stories were, underneath there was a similar dynamic. Their ego was failing to achieve whatever they needed to achieve in their life, and yet from below there were often symptoms emerging, sometimes in their marriages, sometimes in their bodies, sometimes in their emotional life, sometimes in turbulent dreams, sometimes in addictions.
Hollis spends most of his time writing, teaching, and counseling. And as executive director of the Jung Center, which today celebrated Jung's 130th birthday, he wants to see the center grow.
Go back to your 35th birthday, and you're hit with a midlife depression, or you have an enormous marital conflict. We are now teaching about 700 students per semester in our classes here. We have an extensive outreach program, and our hope is to expand all of these activities to become less of a well-kept secret. And the issues that we're trying to address here, I think, are germane to all people. How do you live your life more consciously? What really matters? What are the issues that your life brings you to look at? With another authority figure. People who may or may not have...
Dr. Hollis, thank you for joining us.
My privilege.
How difficult is it to create your own life?
Well, we're making choices every day, choices that at the time seem the right choices for us, but later we might scratch our head and say, what was I thinking about there? How did it lead to this outcome? What about that pattern, that repetition in my life? When we stop and ask, what are our choices in service to really in the unconscious? And of course, the problem is the unconscious is unconscious, so we don't really know what it is. Later, we realize there are archaic scripts, messages buried. We find ourselves often in service to the family of origin values. And usually we don't even begin to reflect on this until it's caused us to stub our toe at some point or cause some suffering in our lives. At that point, we begin to raise some serious questions.
And what motivated you to write this book about creating your own path?
Well, first of all, I'm a human being on a journey, and therefore, I have to ask these questions and stumble through the forest on my own. But also as a therapist, that's my work, and helping individuals arrive at a better place in their life. No one happens to just sort of drop in to have a chat with me. They usually come because their roadmap doesn't apply anymore, or the good efforts that they've had at managing things are just not as effective as they are, or as they once were. And so often there's a sense of disorientation or defeat or confusion, and frankly that's the beginning of wisdom, because that's what forces us to begin to re-examine our lives from a different perspective.
Now later on we'll talk about how to face life's challenges, but I'd like to start with something that you talk about a lot, which is being authentic and creating an authentic life. What do you mean by that, and why is that so important, being authentic?
Well, authentic means that one has somehow a contact with a deep source within each of us. There's something that is inherently true for us. You can call it your instinctual truth or your inborn truth or even the soul, if you will, which is the literal word for the Greek word psyche. What does your soul tell you? What is the psyche trying to tell you? And how do I separate that from all the messages that are coming to me from the culture, again, family of origin, even from my own history? And sort of sort through there and say, all right, which of the messages that I'm in service to or perhaps succumbing to are more appropriate or more consistent with my own inner life and my own nature.
Now, the soul's purpose, I always wonder, how do you know what your soul's purpose is?
Well, I guess the good news is when we get off track, our psyche protests, and we call those protests symptoms. Sometimes they turn up in our relationships, sometimes they show up in our body, sometimes they show up in emotional storms that we have, such as depression, for example, or anxiety disorders, and sometimes they come to us in troubling dreams. And the psyche is always speaking, it's always expressing its point of view, and our task as individuals, and certainly my task as an analyst, is to try to say, well, how do I read the symptomatic response here, and how do I see what it is that is the corrective or the other value that perhaps has been neglected in my life, and sort of bring that into greater play in my choices?
Now, if you're a believer, you're always thinking, well, I wonder what God's will is for me, what's God's will for me, and how do you know what God's will is for me or for you?
That's a question that I consider every day because I think, again, we are subject to so much traffic within. How do we know and how do we sort through? And I think I would turn to the word discernment. It's a discernment process over time. Mm-hmm. I often add to the sentence, what is your God's will for you, or what is the will of the soul? Really, because you have to ask the question really. You can't necessarily trust the first responses because they're the conditioned responses, the archaic mm-hmm. messages and so forth. Over time, there's a discernment process that this feels right for me. It's confirmed by my experience. When I invest myself in these directions, there's a sense of reciprocity that comes back to it. Not just a paycheck or the approval of someone else, but you feel an inner sense of purposefulness and meaning. And when that's not the case, we suffer, and the symptoms come to the surface.
It sounds like you have to be in alignment.
In alignment,
with
absolutely.
Whatever your will is.
Or in the Eastern tradition, getting right with the Tao, as it were.
They're getting right with the Tao, like that. Individuation, that's something that you bring in many of your books. Why is that important? What does it mean?
Individuation is so misunderstood as sort of self-absorption or narcissism. In fact, it's actually a form of submission, the submission of the ego's natural desire for comfort and for consensual approval and for predictability in service to whatever it is that wants to come into the world through us. Individuation is about becoming a person, sort of what the gods intended or what the soul intends, and that has very little to do with what perhaps my ego preferences might be or my comfort zone.
One of the things that we keep hearing, the popular book, The Purpose-Driven Life, how do we find meaning in life, and how do we live a purpose-driven life?
Well, I think in a way meaning is trying to find us. And when I was young, I thought meaning was somehow out there, as if it were hidden in South Dakota. If I could travel enough or read enough or explore enough, I might find it out there.
Right.
When all along there's something inside that's trying to find us, as it were. And that's, again, recognizing the autonomy of our own human psyche that is forever breaking through to us, speaking to us, again, symptomatically through the body, through our feeling function, through our dreams, and so forth. And it's more a question in the long run of trying to pay attention to that dialogue. Frankly, it's a humbling dialogue. It's not so much what my ego wants, it's sort of what wants to express itself through this transient being that I call my life.
Is that what you mean when you say you need to find the guru within you, as opposed to trying to find it somewhere else?
Well, the guru presupposes that there is an authority somewhere that knows something, and we spend our lives, and as children, of course, we are tiny, dependent. We have to look to external authority for whatever instructions we get, and those instructions may be well-intended, but they may or may not be consistent with our inner life and our reality. And so one begins to say, all right, what is it that constitutes a personal authority? Because that's really the primary task of the second half of life, is the sort of reconstruction of, or perhaps establishing a different relationship to personal authority. Meaning by that, quite simply, what is true for you? Now, sort through that process. And can you find the courage to live that and the consistency to live that over time? And that's what leads one in a different path. And a personal authority sounds simple. It's actually many times terrifying because it may not be in accord with one's history, with one's family of origin expectations or one's culture. It means setting off through the forest on one's own, and to find that in those moments there is something within that supports us. Jung actually said once that there's a 2-million-year-old person inside of us. That represents, our instinctual truth. And if we ever can be in contact with that source of wisdom, why, it tells us where we're supposed to go.
Right. Now, you talked about family of origin. How are we impacted by our family of origin? How deeply are we impacted, and what are we supposed to do about it? Well,
there's kind of a psychoanalytic cliche that you lie on a couch and sort of complain about mom and dad, and that is a mistaken perception. Faulkner said once that the past isn't dead, it's not even past. We have to ask ourselves, where were my primal messages acquired about who I am, my worth, my value, my security, my safety? Who's the other, and what are the transactions that go on between us all the time? What is it that constitutes the elemental messages about self and world and coping mechanisms? Because as children, we're tiny, dependent, obliged to adapt, and the adaptations are necessary, in a sense, in relating to the world around us. But the greater the divergence between what the environment is demanding and my own inner life, the greater the split within. So we have to start at least at the beginning to say, all right, what are the primal messages? Do I feel valued? Is my primary need to find security through another? How does the personality get warped around those elemental questions, which are natural to the child, and those elemental adaptations, which are also necessary? And how do they continue to be a kind of autonomous system for us? And how do they constitute a shadow government? Because that's pretty much what's running our life. We're sort of on automatic pilot a good part of the time.
Can you give me an example of that?
Well, I think we're only conscious at certain moments. If you step in the shower in the morning and it's very cold or very hot, you are in that moment absolutely related to, instinctually, to the moment, to the truth. Most of the time, if you really stop and pay attention, one's being flooded by traffic messages of various kinds. And they usually have to do with protecting us from two elemental threats, feeling overwhelmed by life or feeling abandoned by life. And I hate to say this, but so much of the energies that we expend and strategies of adaptation are in service to managing the anxiety about those two elemental archaic threats to our well-being. That someone is going to leave us and not be there and support us in this existential isolation, or on the other hand, override us and flood our boundaries and so forth. So we do develop necessarily, but also often at our own risk and peril in the second half of life, adaptive patterns in relation to those fears.
Now, what I found very interesting that you said was that self-esteem is overrated.
Well,
what do you mean by that?
Yes. Any person, I think, of consciousness and some insight will find many shortfalls, many discrepancies between what we expect from ourselves and our goals in life and so forth. So it's fair to say that I need to be conscious and I need to acknowledge my flaws and the impact that I have on other people. So in a sense, if I'm really honest, I won't have self-esteem. However, at the end of the day, you still have your life to live. You still have a responsibility to live it as constructively as possible. And so I don't think about self-esteem. I think rather, what's the task? What is it that summons me to a meaningful relationship with people? It's like if you're really focused on the journey, the issue of self-esteem just sort of slips away. It becomes less important.
Absolutely. Now, another thing that I found very interesting about your book was boredom. Could be related to self-esteem as well, but boredom is the bankruptcy of the imagination. Tell me about that.
Well, the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. I mean, that's a very ancient perception. Socrates said the same thing 26 centuries ago. But life is infinitely mysterious. There's a mystery from within here. There's a mystery in meeting other people. There's a mystery unfolding in nature. There's a mystery unfolding at all times. And I think boredom represents, in a sense, the failure to engage with mystery. I think our nature is inherently developmental. We desire to know. First sentence of Aristotle's Metaphysics, also 26 centuries ago, is all humans by nature desire to know. The child has this inherent curiosity. What's that? What's that about? How does this happen? And so forth. Where does that go? It's still within us. And so the real question is what lights that fire? What stirs the imagination? What summons us? And those are the places where we need to go. Many times, as a result of our role expectations, even our professional training, we get narrowed into sort of thinning corridors, as it were. And one has to say, all right, outside of this is really the richness of my humanity. Where do I need to grow and develop and learn?
Right. Never stop learning.
Never.
I'd like to read this because for me it was sort of a wow moment. We all need to learn to live with a sense of failure, the difference between our aspirations and real accomplishments, our hopes and our capacities. In other words, accept that we may fail sometimes.
Well, of course we will fail. And again, the key is to be able to extend a certain human compassion and graciousness to ourselves that we might give to someone else, because, in the end, we have infinite expectations and finite possibilities. And again, if we're conscious and we're trying to be responsible about our lives, we will find many areas of shortfall. And there's no point beating oneself up with that. That's dwelling in the past. One has to acknowledge it, say, what do I need to learn from that? Jung put it this way once. He said, most of the time, encounters with the mystery will be experienced as defeats for the ego. Well, how thrilling is that? Because then I'm forced to say, what else do I need to learn here? What do I need to know about myself? What was I not paying attention to there? The Austrian poet, or rather Czech poet, Rilke said once, Our task is to continuously be defeated by ever larger things. Well, who wants to be defeated? And yet, if it's ever larger things, that means I'm growing, I'm developing, I'm in an agenda that leads me more and more to mystery.
That's right. Now, what is the chief task in the second half of life?
Well, I suggested a moment ago that the recovery of personal authority. What is true for you as confirmed from within? Because again, legitimately in childhood, we're obliged to defer that authority that is inherent in the child to whatever, again, the authorities or messages are, family of origin, school, religion, culture, etc. And this is a necessary adaptation and socialization for sure. But again, underneath all of that, there is something that is true or valid for each of us. And reestablishing a connection to that is really the central task. And in a sense, by what authority do you live? It's not a piece of paper on the wall, not a role in life, not a marital status or a relational status. It's like, by what values, in fact, am I living my life? And frankly, a lot of the time, our choices and values are really fear management systems. I say that without judgment because, again, we're obliged to sort of protect this organism in a world that's, in the end, lethal.
Right.
And at the same time, to say the more that I'm caught in these self-protection systems, the more closed I am, the more defined I am by my history. Again, the question is, what wants to come into the world or unfold in history through me? So the human ego becomes a vehicle, in a sense, rather than the goal.
Right, right. And you talk about the goal in life. It shouldn't be happiness. It should be meaning.
Well, whatever happiness is, it's transient. And many of the great people that we would respect in history had a great deal of suffering in their life. They had defeat. They had martyrdom sometimes. We have to think about what is it that really gives my life a sense of purpose and direction. And in the long run, it's not happiness. Now, happiness can flood us at any given moment when we feel that connection with others or we're in harmony with ourselves.
The alignment.
The alignment,
right.
Exactly. Then we'll have a sense of well-being and happiness, but it's like you can't hang on to that. Your life is going to take you in a new direction the next moment in any case.
And how do we deal with the crisis in our lives?
Well, in every crisis, the basic issue is, all right, in this situation over which I overtly have no outer control, or we wouldn't call it a crisis, there's typically a crisis of belief or understanding of self in the world, and you'd have to say, all right, what's the task for me in this situation? In other words, what is it that will lead me to a larger, more empowered position, and what is it really that's diminishing? What is it that takes me back to an earlier place? Even in the face of our mortality, or in the face of very large and perhaps traumatic or shaming events in one's life, you can say, all right, the recovery of a sense of personal autonomy, personal authority, personal direction, these are my tasks in circumstances over which I may have no outer control.
You said death is the creator of life. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think what I was suggesting is that our very mortality obliges us to take this journey seriously and that to recognize that our choices do matter. The Greeks had a myth of a human who was at the same time immortal, and he found that life became sterile and meaningless because you choose this one century, well, change your mind the next century, and so forth. So he went to the gods, and he asked for mortality. And as a blessing, they gave it to him so that his life could be meaningful. In other words, choices then began to matter. It's over against a context.
Right. You've got this amount of time. You better make the best of it.
That's right.
What advice do you give people that think that finding what you call the magical other, in other words, a relationship, to not have to suffer so much or not to be so lonely? What kind of advice do you give people that are looking for that? Most of us are. Looking for that magical other?
Sure. It's a phrase I've used, magical other, because underneath, again at the archaic level, there's the fantasy of finding the perfect parent. Now, no one would say that consciously. No couple at the altar is going to say, well, I want you to be the good parent for me. Take care of me, meet my needs, help me avoid growing up.
Love me no matter what.
No matter what, understand me, absolutely. And that's understandable. That's in us. That's not to be judged. The point is when that is making decisions, what it does is infantilizes the relationship and causes it regressions of one kind or another. You know, the truth is, and I'm not always thrilled by this, it just happens to be true, I believe, that the relationship with the other is never going to be more evolved than the relationship we have to ourselves, because that's what I bring to the table. It's what I bring to children, it's what I bring to my partners, it's what I bring to colleagues. You know, in other words, wherever I'm stuck, blocked, caught in complexes, projections on other people, that creates a style of relationship.
And you say consciousness is a gift. Why?
Well, it is a gift. It's a kind of ambivalent gift because it obliges a sense of the tension of opposites. Without the tension of opposites, there is no choice. There's no real opportunity for growth and development. Jung said once in a letter, he said, actually sometimes the experience of conflict or even suffering is proof that you're living your life well, because it means in those moments the opposites are being honored.
What is the tension of opposites? I'm not clear on that.
Well, in any given situation, there is often this possibility and this possibility. Now, what do you think a person should do then? And you'd say, well, I can't answer that question because I don't know what those values really represent or what those choices embody. The third, he said, is what is important. In other words, you hold the tension of opposites till the third appears, meaning what does this dilemma represent in the developmental process of that individual? So, for example, if a person's in relationship X, should they stay in it, should they leave it? Well, what does each choice really mean? Is it in one case running away from commitment and working something through? In another case, is it necessary to leave in order to live a better life? And once we've framed that question, then you begin to see, well, here is the task that comes up for that person.
How do you know you're living smart?
Well, I don't know. You know,
I agree with you.
In all fairness, it is a continuous humbling process. You have to say every day, what's going on here? Where have I been here before? Is there some archaic pattern that's again imposing itself on me? What messages are flooding me? I don't necessarily have answers. I have questions. And I think if you ask the right questions, you will be led to a more engaged encounter with the meaning of your own journey.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate having you.